Luis, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our transition talk. Today, we are going to be talking about figure skating, but also your transition out of sport. So can you get started with telling us a little bit about your career as a figure skater?
Wow, my career has been about 28 years in the sport of figure skating, and I started at the age of 8. It was not something that I was totally supported or pushed to do by my parents. We're very traditionally Mexican in my family, and it was kind of seen like as a kind of like a girl sport, you know? So it was not something that I was pushed to do. It was something that really came from within me and that I really just loved and wanted to do. And I think that was what kept me with it for so long, that it was a personal choice. Even at a young age, I had that drive already to do and follow that passion that I had. And so as soon as I got into it, I started improving very quickly. And eventually I found myself being taken on by one of the top coaches in the world, who is Frank Carroll. And that's when I moved to Los Angeles. I was living in San Diego, and I moved to Los Angeles to start my training at the age of about 15. Um, and it was quite a sacrifice for my family. My family's home was still in San Diego, and we were commuting 3-4 times a week back and forth just to get my training in. And it was a lot. And so eventually my parents said, like, you're going to have to either live up there on your own if you want to continue this training, or you're going to have to leave the sport. And so I decided that my passion was too great and I wanted to continue. And so I continued, and that's when the improvement really started to happen. And that's when I started to compete on the national level. In the beginning, I actually represented the United States, but I was born in Mexico. And so my father, we all immigrated here for his work. And at that point, as the years progressed, I was getting closer to becoming an adult. And there were a lot of opportunities being thrown at me. One of them was to represent my country of origin. Also, becoming an adult, my immigration status was actually something that was on my mind. I didn't know if I was going to be able to continue living in the United States. So I had a lot of things going on at that time, around 18 years old. And that's when I took the opportunity and I said, I'm going to do it. And so I started competing internationally on that, representing my country. And that led to so much growth and so many opportunities. But with that said, before that all took off, I started to suffer big injuries. And I had started to notice that my performance and my skills, they were starting to leave me at a very young age. I was about 18 years old, and I didn't know what was really happening. I didn't know at the time. I just didn't have a reason as to why I wasn't able to do what I was doing before on a technical level. And so it was very interesting. It was a hard time. I didn't have answers. I was confused. I was scared. And most of all, to be perfectly honest, starting to go into depression because I did not know what was happening to my body. I didn't really know how to maneuver with this new body, this new feeling, whatever I was going through. I didn't understand. I kept competing for my country, etc., but my level kept going down and down, and I didn't understand what was happening until one day I just had excruciating pain in my hips. That's when I had a diagnosis that both of my hips had severe tears. That's when I finally realized, like, okay, something is definitely really wrong. It's not just me mentally falling apart. And I started to explore from that moment on. I started to explore, like, what led to these injuries? Like, how did I get to this place without me even realizing what was happening all along? That's when I realized, that there had been severe overtraining, some irresponsible coaching, and also some irresponsibility on my part of not taking care of my body, not taking care of, my person, and not even tuning into what I was feeling a lot of the time. So that was a really interesting turn in my career. And that's when everything changed for me. Actually, from that point on, I was able to reevaluate the way that I went about my training, my career, my life. And I think that's when my story starts for myself. Like, that's when the real Luis athlete story begins. after that downfall and that learning experience and coming to myself and then moving forward from there.
Luis, it's a really interesting story that you're telling us, because most athletes who go through a period of severe injury like you did and decreased performance, usually that leads to leaving the sport and retiring. But you pushed through and you found a different way, a different part of yourself, but a different way to train as well. And so how was your career after that?
It was amazing. I actually took charge of my career, took ownership of myself, and I was able to then, after that, become a 6-time national champion. I set some records for my country and as the highest standings ever to date in certain competitions. And so it was really unheard of as well, because a lot of people thought like, oh, like this guy is done. He won't be able to really continue, like it's unheard of. And I also had a lot of naysayers. I had a lot of people that questioned, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you still going? You know, and I have zero regrets. I wouldn't be sitting here with you today chatting about things like these and these topics and being able to hopefully inspire somebody else. So, you know, for me, it was pretty magical in many ways, you know, like being able to continue and then to have all of those successful competitions and to travel the world after that. That's when my career really took off. I was able to also compete at 4 world championships, multiple international competitions. And it was just a new way of being, a very different way of being. And I just wouldn't take it back. I mean, ever.
What was the biggest change during that period? You talk about different things, but was there a mindset change? Is that what kept you going? Like, how do you see those two different periods?
Completely, like night and day. Figure skating is a highly judgmental sport. It's very cutthroat. It's very tough. And I mean, I love figure skating and I love the people in it. But it's such a tough sport to remain honest and truthful to yourself, because you're always trying to meet a standard or somebody else's standard. And so the mindset change was like, wow, now I have my own standards and my own like bar that I set for myself. And that was still to this day, it's hard for me to take out the voices in my head that are constantly judging everything that I'm doing. And so the biggest change for me was learning to accept what is and learning to be gentle with myself, but also honest. That was really tough because I was never taught to be gentle to myself in skating. I was never taught to say, wow, I'm exhausted today. It's okay if I take a recovery moment, you know, like the littlest things like those. It was, yeah, and they make all the difference to learn how to have a gentleness about your training, about yourself, for yourself. It's pretty unheard of in my sport, and that was really what saved what I had left in my career and what saved my life, I would say, to this day, because there were some very dark moments, especially in that injury period. You know, everything from eating disorders to suicidal thoughts to major depression. And it all stemmed from me seeing my abilities slip away and feeling like my worth was also slipping away. And that was another thing. After the injuries, I learned that my value is not only for being a figure skater. My worth isn't only based on what I can land that day, what jump I did. And that was an exploration that continued to grow. Like, wow, there's more to me than this figure skater or this guy that does the triple, whatever. And I think that was the biggest change internally for me.
It's fantastic to hear your story. I can relate to the need for authenticity and that being difficult in a sport like figure skating. It's similar in synchronized swimming. I imagine it's the same in gymnastic and rhythmic gymnastic, where you're always playing a character. So it's difficult to be yourself while playing that character, and you're always performing. You have to at training, you have to at competition, and sometimes you get lost in that role, I think. So interesting to hear your comment on that. But also the other side, you talked about you being wrapped up in your athletic identity, which is pretty common of a lot of athletes, especially when you start your sport so early on and it requires so much of your time, you're fully dedicated to it. The discovery of your self-worth outside of sport is usually something that happens after transitioning away from sport. So I think it's fantastic that you were able to develop yourself fully and away from the sport while you were still in your career and while you were still competing. And that's how I imagine why your career was so well afterwards. And you felt, you describe it as magical, but it seems to me that you were more yourself. Did you ever think during that period of time when things were difficult of actually leaving the sport and moving on?
Oh, absolutely. Many times. And I actually, in all honesty, during the injuries, I did leave the sport for a while. And it wasn't very long that I left it, but it was about, by the 4th month, I was like, wow, no, like I was going to college. I was kind of trying to lead the normal life, as you would call it. But it was, I was missing something. And it was too much a part of me and too much in my heart and athletes in my soul, like it was something that I wasn't ready to leave behind. And I think that's another thing. I think that athletes need to really take away the voices, the outside influences. That decision of leaving the sport is so internal and it's so personal. And looking back, if I had listened to people, I would have had great regrets had I left the sport before the time that I left it. So that's huge, yeah.
And that led you to have a pretty long career. I mean, 28 years is it's incredible. Not a lot of athletes can say they've spent that much time in that sport.
Yeah.
So that's pretty amazing. So when came the actual retirement? How did it come about? How did you feel about now leaving at that point?
So it was right previous to my 6th national title. It was that season, and I felt that I knew myself enough at that point, well enough to say, I'm ready for the next chapter. Like, I'm ready to explore what else life has to offer. And so I knew starting that season that it would be my last, and that I would most likely make my national competition my last competition that I would skate in. And the way that I knew that it was right was I felt so at peace with the thought. And there were no fears, and there were no longer threatening voices in my head. There was nothing that felt unnatural. And that's when I knew, like, wow, this is it. I'm finally at a point where I can move on with peace in my heart, peace in my person. And that I just knew. And it was like, okay, I think it had to do with me really knowing myself and knowing that things were going to be okay, that I was going to be okay wherever I was off to next. And also I had found I had really started to tune into what my talents are as not just a skater, but as a person. And so that, I think, gave me great confidence.
What a nice way to do it. Being able to take your time, see it coming, have a season that you go through knowing that it will be the end and that you're prepared. It sounds like a pretty calculated decision by that time in your career. How was the few months after you retired? Because even though you were prepared, even though you had made that decision, it is still a change, physically definitely. So I'm curious how you felt afterwards.
It was very interesting, to say the least. Um, Firstly, I want to say that I was very lucky. I had a lot of strong relationships prior to my retirement that I had built over many, many years. And so as soon as I retired, I was invited to teach seminars, to go travel and teach and coach kids around Mexico, the US. I was very lucky in that way. But also very confused, especially even about little things like my fitness. I thought, wait a minute, okay, I retired as an elite athlete, you know, like I competed, I just won a national title. I was training like I was about to compete, and it was just hilarious. I was tiring myself out, exhausted, and then I was like, what am I doing? Why am I still doing this? It was like this rat on a wheel kind of thing, you know? And so it was very confusing. Also, I because of my prior experience and learning how to listen to my body, I did have to take a moment to sit down and say like, whoa, what are you feeling? What are you avoiding? Like, why are you still trying to like train for a gold medal when you're done? Like, this is it. Your body can finally recover. And so I had to sit down, and it made me realize, like, in a way I was trying to avoid some of the emotions that were left over. It was so easy to just go train for 2 hours and, you know, do a crazy training session or at the gym or whatever. And I started to realize, like, why don't we replace that with some introspection time? And so I kind of had this balance of like, okay, you can train, but I also want to know what you're feeling, Luis. Like, what's going on in there? You know, what are you feeling? And there were a lot of emotions that I had to explore, and they weren't all pretty. Like, it's not all pretty, you know. There was a lot of grief, a lot of emotions that I had not tapped into even during my career. Even though I was very self-aware, the rhythm of a career at the top level does not really give you the time to fully sit with yourself sometimes. And so I started to fully sit with myself, and even more like healing took place because of that. Mental, inner healing, and obviously physical as well. My body just needed to recover. 28 years pounding those bones. It's like, you know?
Definitely, and I love how you talk about sitting with yourself and getting to learn those emotions that you haven't explored when you were an athlete, because I think we're just taught to push through, and there's also a matter of time that you can't deal with everything, you know, competing, being ready to go all the time, and having to also process emotions. Sometimes something has to go. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about that. I really enjoy it. You talked about developing other interests than figure skating while you were still in training. Can you elaborate a little bit on this, on how you did this, why you did it? I think it's a really, really important topic for athletes that are still competing, and developing as a whole athletes, for me, is a sign of a really prosperous career, and a career that's going to go in the long term.
Perfect honesty. For me, it took the way of creating relationships completely outside of my sport. Completely outside of my sport. And I have Pamela, who I talked about earlier, my trainer, I have her to thank very much for, because while I was working with her, she started to introduce me to other athletes who she worked with as a therapist. And also, I started to see that very quickly that my world had been a very small bubble. And that little introduction to different people from different facets of life, it was like a snowball effect. Once I started to meet people, I was like, wait, I want to know more about, you know, this topic, this dance world. Like, let me explore this dance world. Let me explore that world over there. Like, what is this business world about a little bit? Like, let me start. So I started to give myself the time to create friendships and new relationships completely outside of my sport. And that's actually not very common in my sport. As when you're an athlete, you're really very isolated and very much like you stick with your people. And I started to have the courage to explore outside, to start to even if it was something silly, like I would be at a coffee shop and, hey, pick up a conversation with like somebody that I have no idea who they are, but they seem friendly. Start to just chat, a small chat, and little things like that that you wouldn't necessarily feel compelled to do when you're in that like mindset of train. But it started as easy as that, little talks here, there, reaching out and creating new friendships completely outside of my sport.
That's great, because I think I agree with you. A lot of athletes don't necessarily have any social network outside of their sport. I mean, your teammates, your partners, your competitors, those are the people that you are with all the time. So being able to have that perspective is fantastic. You mentioned also being in touch with other athletes. Were you able to talk to other athletes about strategy, mental strategy, or mindset, or things like that, or was it always more casual?
I would say that it would start very casual, and it did get deeper. It did get deeper, and I think that led to me developing perspective that a lot of the topics that I was, living in my career in my sport were not just central to my sport. Like stuff was going on in other sports as well, positive and negative. But it opened my eyes. Yes, it opened my eyes to when you start to be vulnerable with another person and you start to really get to know what's going on. It opened my eyes to seeing that, oh, like this theme is not just central to me or to my sport. It opens your mind. It opens your mind to realize like, oh, this is bigger than yourself. That was important, to have some intimacy with other athletes in that way.
Now that you're retired, you mentioned you don't have any regrets. I'm curious if you've achieved everything you wanted to achieve in your sport.
As an athlete, I have to say that I did probably more than I thought that I would be able to do, especially halfway through my career. I really thought that it would be over. And I have to say I did more. I surprised myself. So that was really beautiful to take that feeling with me. There was more to it. It wasn't just about winning a championship or being the highest ranked from my country. It started to become more about seeing that sport can be even better, even more positive, even more supportive for athletes. I think that is my goal to this day. And I feel like I haven't succeeded yet at it. I feel like I want to give back in a way that will actually create some change, because whether we like it or not, there are a lot of things that still need to evolve in my sport and all of sport. And as I'm sure people are aware, there's a lot of things that are going on that are not the healthiest for athletes. And I still believe that can be changed. And so I'm not done with sport, and I'm not done with my career.
It's amazing to be able to move from, more self-centered goals and expand them and see them transpire past your career, right? Past your athletic career. While you still stay in sport, you're still contributing, and you want to do more and change things. I think it's really commendable. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and how you intend to change things.
I began coaching right away after retirement, and it was something that was very in my heart. Like I said, I really wanted to give back. And so I started coaching, and I was taking a very athlete first approach in my coaching. I still am. I still do coach part-time. And I began to realize that as much as I was giving my all to support athletes, our culture is still really behind. So, for instance, I would try to instill athlete-first practices at the center that I was working out of. And they were so kind and they were always supportive, but they just didn't have the infrastructure to support an athlete-first training environment. And I started to look around and I started to notice, like, well, it's the same story that I lived when I was training before those injuries. Things weren't in place for putting the athlete first. And there was no education. And so the overtraining did happen. The irresponsible moments happened, like all of those things were true and real. Like it wasn't imagined. There were things that were mismanaged, and it wasn't all on the coaches or on me. It was even things like not having the proper area for stretching for a kid in a training center, little things like that, that are overseen, but that are so important to athletes for them to stay healthy mentally, physically, emotionally. And so I started to see that, okay, we're still missing a lot. And I didn't know how, but I knew that there needed to be standards of how to support athletes and how to keep them safe emotionally, mentally, physically. And even though there are a lot of great programs in place, they still all missed the mark. And so that's when I joined forces with my therapist as trainer, Pamela Avon, and we sat down and I said, like, Pam, I'm really trying hard to pass on everything that I learned, and it's not being effective because I don't have the support, and I don't have the support from just the culture that we have currently. And so we sat down, and that's when she said, okay, I have other athletes who came to me with the same story, the same thing. They're retired now trying to teach, and they feel a little bit trapped. And she said, okay. And about 2-3 years passed of just brainstorming, and that's when we came up with the certification that's actually for sports centers that will educate sports center owners. Like, what is it that your center needs, not only to support athletes, but also thrive, like for your centers to thrive. And that's another thing. A lot of centers have fear that if they create change in their centers, that it won't be economically, supportive. We were like, wow, we really need to create a system that will allow centers to thrive financially as well as on all levels. And so that's what we created. We created certification, and that's what right now we're in the development aspect. And I'm just excited. I'm following my heart and my passion, and also using the brain, because we got to use our brains.
We're gonna diving into the certification a little bit, but before that, I wanted to hear your definition of athlete first and athlete-centered training approach. I think it's sort of a buzzword now. The general discourse is changing, and people really want to put back the athlete at the center of the training. Can you give us your definition of it, but also example of how that would look like?
So for me, athlete first training is, you are not only helping an athlete achieve their goals to be a champion or to medal, you are helping this athlete to be the healthiest, best version of themselves. And sometimes that looks like your coaching says, hey, I see you're struggling today. I see that you're very tired. I see that maybe you need a minute. Maybe you need some recovery time. Maybe you need support, mental health support. It's so easy to just focus on, I'm here as a coach to push the skater to be a champion at any cost. And athlete first training is, I'm here to support this person to, yes, achieve their goals as an athlete, but to also be the best version, healthiest version of themselves.
I think this is really important because you said person, not athlete, and is having that relationship with your coach, and your coach recognizing that your worth is not linked just to your athletic ability, but to the person that you are. And I feel there's an emphasis on, just good values and soft skills as a person, not just related to what you do on the ice or in the pool or on the field. And I think changing that narrative is really important. When you were competing and you were going through your tough time, who was helping you through that situation? Did you receive the support that you're trying to provide now to athletes who may go through the same thing? Is what you're doing sort of based on the learning experience that you have, the things you received, but also the things you haven't received?
That gives me goosebumps. Absolutely. I had to find my own support, my own answers. And that point at 18, depressed, eating disordered, suicidal. There were no resources for me to seek the support that I needed. And in that moment, I felt very alone. And I also felt great shame because I said, wow, here I am completely destroyed as an athlete. Not only am I now feeling like a failure, but I'm also feeling crazy. Like, wow, I'm the guy that goes to the psychologist, that needs therapy, that needs support, that needs, so that was tough. That was really tough. And no, there were no resources. And absolutely, that led to this point in my career, yes.
Any support coming from your family or close friend or people that you grew up with, or did you feel that perhaps they didn't necessarily even understand the situation you were in?
That's very, very spot on. I don't think that they did not understand the situation. They thought, wow, like, we're supporting you to achieve your goals, and that's really all. I don't blame them. That it's hard to understand unless you're actually living it as an athlete. It's very hard for parents to understand, and so they just supported me and loved me, but they couldn't necessarily. How could they understand? They had never been an athlete, a top athlete. They had no idea what was happening.
Typically, families are supportive and they're vested and they drive you everywhere and they try to do everything they can. But going into understanding that this part of you, that's the biggest part of you, maybe it's your whole, is sort of gone or threatened, and that makes you completely just losing your balance. That's really hard for people to understand, I think, unless you've lived it. I agree with that. What's the response that you're getting from athletes, coaches, managers of centers? How is that perceived?
Very exciting, because nothing has really been introduced like this, where we are actually offering and targeting the whole sports center, which is the athlete's home. That's their home, And so it's very innovative, and we're really receiving great praise. They're very surprised. Also, it's been years of development, and so it's very detailed. And I think that people are surprised by that, by the attention to the details and to be honest, to the labor and the heart that's in it. I think people are really accepting it and really taking it in well because of that, because of the attention to the detail.
It is also a change that's coming to a local level that sometimes is a little bit forgotten. And so I can imagine that for coaches in those centers, local athlete, it feels good when the trickle message, when the message trickles down like this. I think it's quite exciting. So Luis, I want to ask you one last question, and it's really a recommendation, either to your younger self or to someone out there who may be struggling with similar challenges as yours. I would like to know if there are things you would do differently, one, to prepare for your transition, but also when the time of the transition comes.
There are so many, now that I'm years, out of retirement, I realize there are so many wonderful people out there that really do have good intentions, and you want to seek those people out. Say, you're not alone, like in this retirement phase. There are people out there that are more than happy to, even like you guys, there are people out there that are more than willing to give you advice, to lead you to your next venture, next phase. And I think it's very important that you realize, like I would tell myself, hey, you're not alone. there are people out there. Allow yourself to seek support, help, advice. So that's my biggest recommendation.
Would you have tried to seek those people out before the tough time comes? Is this something that you would consider, of like building a network of people around you that you trust? I think sometimes athletes feel alone and feel that they can't speak to anybody because they don't feel that the people around them are necessarily trustworthy, and if they are, they might be cited. You know, for example, I'm thinking of a coach. You don't really want to open up to your coach because you worry about them changing their decision about your selection or your training. So would you encourage people to seek out support before, or to build some sort of network, and how would you do that?
Start to build a network for sure before. And I would say, especially online now, there are so many resources nowadays, like many more than ever, than at least when I was around. I mean, there was nothing. So there are resources on the internet. You can get online, you can start to, create those connections little by little. But yeah, definitely before, build a network and, start building your own support system.
We're all online these days. We're on social media. Just following role models or people that you are inspired by. At some point, you'll see them say, just reach out if you need anything. I've had an interview with another athlete last week, and that's what she said. Just reach out. I'm here to help. Louis, thank you for sharing your story and being so candid about the sentiment throughout your journey. I think that was really interesting to hear. So thank you so much for your contribution. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for your platform and giving me this opportunity as well.